So I review many commander decks, and one of the most common things that I see is that ramp, one of the things that like card draw is universally supposed to make a deck better and more consistent, is instead often making decks worse, or worse yet actually completely breaking otherwise great decks. And right now you're probably thinking that the ramp in your decks is great, and that this doesn't apply to you, but based on my experience there's a pretty good chance that it actually does. To help you to figure out whether you're safe or in the danger zone, we're going to answer some questions like what kind of ramp should your deck even be running? And how much of it should it have? And critically, should you even be running ramp in the first place? Questions that on the surface may seem incredibly simple and obvious but are actually pretty tricky. Regardless of whether you're a few decks deep or you've been brewing for years, I'm going to share a few simple concepts that I'm willing to bet will completely change how you think about ramp in your commander decks. So stick around till later to answer all of these and to know exactly how much ramp your deck should actually be running. Now this video was triggered by a deck review of everyone's favorite dinosaur, Pantlaza. A deck review that highlights almost all the different aspects of what you need to consider about ramp so clearly that it's almost the perfect case study. But before we get to that, we need to get two fundamental basics out of the way. Firstly, whenever you're working on your decks, you need to turn your brain's autopilot off. This is sort of an underlying lesson for everything in deck building, but it's equally applicable to ramp. What I mean by this here is not just autopiloting and running all the same ramp sources in every single deck. Some decks want Birds of Paradise, some want 3 visits, and some want Cultivate, some want a combination, and some want absolutely none at all. But not every deck wants to run a spell like Cultivate, yet I see it in so many decks where it simply doesn't make any sense, like a deck that's running a 3-cast commander and nothing that it really wants to ramp towards. Secondly, don't be greedy. This one is very tough, as almost all of us want to squeeze as much juice as we can get into every bit of our commander decks. In a Pantlaza deck, that means another sick dinosaur rather than something boring like a land, ramp, or card draw spell. Dinosaurs are inherently way more interesting than vegetables, but this type of thinking is what makes people run 32 lands and a handful of ramp spells only to get land screwed every second game. Or to spend their turns investing their mana and card advantage into ramping only to miss their land drop on that or the next turn when they could simply have hit their land drop instead. Don't let that be you. The average commander deck should run around 45 to 50 mana sources regardless of type or bracket. Your elves deck that runs 30 lands also runs 15 or more mana producing elves, and your high power fringe CDH deck that runs a similar amount of lands is probably running all sorts of free mana generation and free spells that have a similar effect. There are exceptions to every single rule, but 90% of the time your deck is not the exception and you're simply instead making a bad decision with misguided justifications. Now these are generic underlying deck building fundamentals and are less specific to ramp, so let's get back to our Pantlaza case study and talk all about ramp. The main issue with the deck that I was helping with, and the reason that I was helping, was because the deck was very inconsistent, and the owner was struggling in figuring out their ramp. And the deck in question had a lot of ramp. Almost 20 ramp sources, which is far too much in most cases. Yes, you can actually be running too much ramp, and seeing this led me to ask the first question that I ask about ramp when building any deck, and that is, does this deck need ramp at all? That question is often answered by answering another related question, which is what are we going to be ramping towards? All that ramp does in our decks is help us to get to a certain amount of mana to execute on a certain game plan a turn or a few turns earlier than we normally would. So to know whether or not we need a ramp, we have to be very clear about what the game plan is that we're trying to execute, which cards we need to execute it, and by what turn we are hoping to execute that game plan. Now there's a lot of important information in that single sentence, so I want to reiterate it. You only want ramp in your deck if it's going to help you execute on your game plan and play certain key cards earlier than you would if you had simply hit your land drops every turn. If you're trying to play multiple 6 mana spells on turn 8, well then mathematically you need 4 more mana even if you hit all your land drops, so you have to have ramp. Remember that ramp is not just about accelerating your mana for no reason, but it's about accelerating towards something very specific that gives you hard numbers you can aim for, which makes ramp far more like maths than just vibes. Now back to the dinosaurs, in this case it was a bracket 3 Pantlaza deck, so because of the bracket we're going to get about 7 turns to execute our ideal game plan. Here the original goal before I got involved was to get Pantlaza out as early as possible, ideally on turn 3 so we can take advantage of her discover sooner and rapidly power out a board of big dinosaurs to start removing our opponents. Given most of these dinosaurs cost more than 6 mana, it does make logical sense that we're trying to ramp to far more than 6 or 7 mana before the game likely ends on turn 7 to 8. In this deck, there were a bunch of 1-mana dorks and a mixture of 3-mana ramp spells in the deck to achieve this. The issue here, and part of the reason why the deck was facing consistency issues, is that running 20 ramp cards to reliably get Pantlaza out on turn 3 means that we have less space for all the other good stuff that we need in our deck. It's really the inverse of the greedy problem we just talked about. Well, it's still greedy, but now it's just greedy in a sense that it's trying to get Pantlaza out on turn 3 instead of on turn 4 or 5. We've gone from all the dinos good stuff greed to speed greed. This means that quite often we'd be getting Pantlaza into play early, but our hand would often have either excess ramp spells or lands and no dinosaurs to play to take advantage of all our mana. So much room for activities and absolutely no friends to play with. It's good to remember that everything in deck building is a balance, because by including one thing we have to automatically exclude something else. For example, if you want to keep the dream of the turn 3 Pantlaza play alive, well, we could run less land so we don't draw too much of it, but then we may get stuck at 5 or 6 lands, or worse yet, may draw our ramp sources and no lands to play them. Or we could choose to keep a reasonable land count and run more card draw, but now instead of following Pantlaza up with a dinosaur, we may have to spend that turn on drawing cards, which defeats the whole point of having Pantlaza in play a turn earlier. As I said, everything is give and take, and failing to plan is just planning to fail. Now with all that said, let's come back to our core question. What are we trying to ramp to, and does this deck need ramp in the first place? In the case of this Pantlaza deck, our game revolves around playing a 5-mana commander, and then casting 5, 6, 7, or even 8-mana dinosaurs. And given this is a bracket 3 deck where our core game plan needs to be threatening by turn 7, then I'd say yes, we definitely need ramp, but our ramp should probably look a little bit different than it looks right now. The bracket sets an expectation of how many turns we get, which in turn sets an expectation for how much total mana we can generate and then what we can do or cast with that mana. Because of this, bracket 2, 3, or 4 decks will tend to look different in the cards that they include and the strategies or game plans that they build with them. This is because each one has a different game length, and each game length gives us more or less resources to work with to execute our entire game plan. Now before we get to the actual ramp spells that we should play in this deck or in general, we should now assess what our ideal game plan is, because our ramp needs to fit into and facilitate the game plan and our ideal mana curve. So let's think about our ideal bracket 3 Pantlaza game plan. And yes, I know this is getting pretty deep into Pantlaza, but again, this is the vehicle I'm using to show the different things that impact ramp in your deck. If you're a regular here, you likely know what's coming next, and that's starting with the end in mind. The end game state that we want to reach here is a whole heap of angry dinosaurs that in turn get more dinosaurs, which we can then turn sideways to deal combat damage and cause all sorts of problems. And our best way to get there is getting Pantlaza into play and then turn after turn playing problematic dinos that hopefully get us more problematic dinos or things to augment them via her discover triggers. Doing things like playing a Wrathful Raptors and discovering into a Devil Dinosaur. Given we really need to ramp in bracket 3 to get to this game plan earlier, we have the option of ramping on turn 1 with a card like Birds of Paradise, turn 2 with something like 3 Visits, or turn 3 with something like Cultivate. There are other options like Marauding Raptor at 2 mana or Urza's Incubator at 3, but let's not get too lost in the weeds. These are effectively different effects achieving the same outcome. Typically in Magic, the more mana you spend on the card, the more powerful it is, so casting ramp on turn 3 should give us objectively more strong ramp. But casting these ramp spells on turn 3 also has the highest opportunity cost when compared to turn 1 or 2 ramp, because often we're doing little to nothing else on those turns, and we could be casting something else on turn 3 instead, like casting great 4 mana spells on turn 3 if we ramped on turn 1 or 2. In this case, rather than going turn 1 ramp into turn 2 ramp into turn 3 Pantlaza and turn 4 potential existential crisis, I advocated for different ramp entirely. My thought was that ideally we want to be playing Pantlaza on turn 4, so any kind of ramp that we can play before that is okay. But really I think we want explosive ramp, because on turn 5, we ideally want to be casting a big powerful dinosaur at 6 or more mana value. Rather than Birds, Rampant Growth, or Kodama's Reach, we now look towards cards like Bloom Tender, Fanatic of Ronas, or Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. Any of these will get us to turn 4 Pantlaza and allow us to untap with 6, 7, or even more mana on turn 5. This will create as or even more explosive plays than the turn 3 Pantlaza did, and we need less slots in our deck to achieve this. And because we can now reclaim space in the deck, but not needing to run as many ramp cards to facilitate that turn 3 Pantlaza, we can add other great additions to the deck, like Haste Enablers or other cards that cost 4 mana, like Enduring Courage, Sneak Attack, Greater Good, or Defense of the Heart. In prioritizing the turn 3 Pantlaza play, we were effectively eliminating the 4 mana cost slot from our deck. Now this should hopefully show you how thinking differently about what a deck wants to do affects how we want to get there, and that has a big impact on how and on what turns your deck wants to ramp. But that's if your deck wants to ramp at all, because for all the talk about getting your ramp right, I've got a deck where the correct answer was to run 0 ramp on purpose, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. Speaking of doing things on purpose, the YouTube For You page is a very fickle beast. So if you're enjoying this, you should like the video to tell the algorithm that you think it's good, and subscribe if you haven't already to make sure that my next video gets delivered directly into your eyeballs. Now what kind of ramp your deck wants will depend entirely on what it's doing. Decks that are trying to go fast, like aggro or combo decks, will often favor one-off bursts of mana, like rituals, like Seething Song, or treasure creation, like Unexpected Windfall. You're trading long-term power and stability for short-term power instead. In a deck like my Stellar Lee deck, where I'm aiming to combo out on turn 4 or 5, I'm building to one turn where I have enough mana to execute my entire combo, and in that way, a treasure is as good as a land. That's very different to this Pantlaza build, because bursts of mana do a lot less for us here. We need repetitive mana sources, because we're aiming to cast big chunky dinos 4 turns in a row to take advantage of Pantlaza's trigger, and that only happens once per turn. Big once-off mana generation could do a lot, but it could also end up doing very little. So rather than safe ramp spells that fetch a land like Cultivate, or very high-risk rituals, we favor a middle ground like Solvala, who has a much higher payoff than a Cultivate because of our game plan of big creatures with high powers, but also sticks around turn after turn, unlike a Mana Geyser. This is different again to my Ian Malcolm skinned Atlapalani deck, despite both decks being full of big dinosaurs. Rather than this approach with Pantlaza, I'm running 3 visits, rampant growth, and a bunch of mana rocks. Why mana rocks? Well, because Atlapalani's trigger looks for creatures in our deck whenever an egg gets destroyed, and I only want to flip into the biggest, chunkiest dinos when my eggs get crushed. Any form of mana dork would ruin this game plan, and my whole goal here is to play Ian on turn 3, so rocks and ramp spells that cost 2 mana are actually very good here. In contrast, my Merrin deck also wants ramp, but exclusively in the form of 1 to 2 cost mana dorks, because I actively want them to die in the mid game so I can farm experience counters to recur big problematic threats like a Gary or Kakusho. And sometimes ramp just lives in the command zone, like my Bracket 2 Emmett Salk deck or something like Snail's Rada deck. Then there's the no ramp deck that I talked about earlier, my Bracket 3 Vincent aggro deck, where the right answer is no ramp at all. And that's because the whole game plan is to come out swinging on curve with cheap aggressive threats, and every slot I spend on a mana rock or dork is a slot not spent on pressure, and ramping would actively slow the deck down. In a deck that's all about using every resource it has to fairly beat opponents before they're ready, slowing down my game plan in any way instantly kills this deck. Now hopefully these different flavors of decks will help you understand how different decks want different things, and that's especially true of ramp. And all of this brings us to the thing that I promised you at the start, and that's how much ramp that your deck should actually run. Whilst which ramp you should run is a little bit more subjective, how much you should run is a bit more mathematical, and the answer is about 12. If you're running ramp, then in almost all cases you're going to want to be ramping by about turn 3. And if that's the case, running 12 sources of ramp in your deck will pretty reliably provide you with a ramp card in your hand in the first 3 turns of the game. I see ramp as a pretty binary thing. You either want it, in which case you need it every time, or you don't need it at all. And if you want it, then you need 12. This paired with 36 to 38 lands puts you right in that band of 40 to 50 mana sources where you want to be in the average deck. So don't let me find out that you're putting 6 mana rocks in your deck, because all that tells me is that you're not clear about what your game plan is, and that you should evaluate that all again before you think about ramp. Now to give you the ramp cheat sheet, the next time you're building a deck and thinking about what ramp to add, ask yourself these questions. Firstly, what are you ramping towards? By which turn? And do you even need ramp in your deck? Next, if you do, what is your game plan? What spells are you casting? On which turns? And what's your ideal mana curve? And lastly, what kind of deck are you building? And what are the best cards now available to help you achieve your ramp goals? I'm going to reiterate that everything you add to your deck comes at a cost, and that in adding one thing, you have to end up removing something else. In trying to achieve your game plan earlier than if you otherwise would, if you're using ramp to do that, you're giving up at least 10% of the space in your entire deck, or 15% of your non-land cards, to do that. If you have questions about ramp or anything else I've shared in this video, yap at me in the comments or in the base deck department Discord, or come and yap at me live when I stream on Saturday at 8 PM Eastern Time. If you like this sort of advice that I did with Pantlaza and you want similar personalized help for your decks, I offer that over on my Ko-fi. And if you want to support what I do, head over to my Patreon, and a big thank you to everyone that supports me over there. I really appreciate it, and you don't take advantage of your special Discord channel nearly as much as you should. There's links to all of that right below the like button that you're currently surely ramping all over. Lastly, if you like this, go and check out my video on some of the maths behind how many cards of different types you should be running in your deck. Or this recent video that you probably didn't see about how I'd approach a new build from scratch today. And as always, thank you for being here.